In this tutorial, you will create a rule for changing an input value into an output, plot a function that describes this rule, and create and use a parameter. First, you'll plot a point on the x-axis and create an output rule using Sketchpad's calculator. You'll plot the output point and trace it. Next, you'll plot a function using Sketchpad's calculator. You'll create a parameter and add it to your function. Finally, you'll use the parameter to graph a family of functions. Before I plot a function, I'm going to build a model that develops the idea of a function using an input-output rule. So I'll open a new sketch, and I'll choose Graph, Define Coordinate System. Notice this coordinate system has 2 points that control it. The point at 0, 0 is called the origin point, and you can use it to drag the coordinate system around the plane. And this point at 1, 0 is called the unit point, and you can use it to change the scale of the coordinate system. So to build my model, I'm going to start by constructing a point on the x-axis. There. Then I'm going to measure the x-coordinate of this point. So I'll choose Measure, abscissa x. Abscissa is another word for x-coordinate. So you see it labels the point as A, and I get the value x sub a, or the x-coordinate of a. And if I drag the point, I see that the value of the x-coordinate changes. So next I'm going to create a rule that takes this value and gives an output value. So I will choose Number, Calculate, and that brings up the calculator. And I could enter in any rule I like. I think I'll enter 2 times, and then I'll click on this value in my sketch, 2 times x sub a minus 3. And I'll click OK. So now I want to label these as my in and out values. So I'll choose the text tool, and I'll double click the measurement, and that allows me to change its label, which I'll change to in, and click OK. And notice that it changed the label to in the calculation as well, but I want to change this to out, so I'll double click it, and I'll label this out, and click OK. So now I have my 2 values of in and out. Well, I'd like to see these plotted on my graph. So I will, in order, choose in and out. I have to choose them in the order of x-coordinate, y-coordinate, and I'll choose Graph, Plot as xy. So I get this point, and notice if I move point A, the new point moves as well, and you see that it always has the same x-coordinate as A, but its y-coordinate is changing in a linear way. If I wanted to look at this motion in more detail, I could click an empty space and then select this point and choose Display, Trace Plotted Point. Now when I drag point A back and forth, I see the line that I thought was what was happening being traced out. So now I know that the output value depends linearly on the input value. So next I'd like to plot the function that describes this rule. So I'll choose Graph, Plot New Function. And I will use the same rule that I used before. So in this case 2 times, except now I will click the X button instead of using my in value. So 2 times x minus 3. And I'll click OK. So notice that my function is lying over my traces, which is what I wanted, and if yours doesn't, double-click your function and edit it so that it matches your in-out rule. So now I don't really want to see point A in the traces anymore, so I will click on point A and press Delete on my keyboard. And will choose Display, Erase Traces. Now I just have the equation and the graph of my function. And right now, this equation is displayed in f of x notation, but if I double-click it, I could also change it to display in y equals notation by clicking Equation and then choosing y equals and clicking OK. And I think I'll change my grid, which I can do in several ways, one of which is I can drag a number, drag this -5 until I can see -10, 10 on the x-axis. And notice that as I'm dragging these, that the x and y axes are changing at the same scale. But if I wanted to have them change at different scales, I could choose Graph, Grid Form, Rectangular, and then I get a unit point on the y-axis as well as on the x-axis, and this point controls just the y-axis, and now this point controls just the x-axis, so I can change the scales separately. So up until this point, I've been looking at only one line, first through my in-out rule, and then through graphing in the function. Well, I'd like to look at a lot of different lines, and the way that I'll do this is to create a parameter, which is a simple numeric value that can change, and I'll use that parameter in my function. So to start, I'll choose Number, New Parameter, and I'll name the parameter m, and I'll just give it an initial value of 2. And click OK. So now I'll double-click my function, and I'll delete the 2 in my function, and double-click on m in my sketch, and click OK. So now my function changes to say mx minus 3 instead of 2x minus 3, but my graph hasn't actually changed because m is now 2. But what if we changed m? I can do that several different ways. One way is just by clicking in this box and typing a new value, say 3, and pressing Enter, and see the function shifted because it's now 3x minus 3. And another way I can change this is by pressing plus and minus on my keyboard. So watch what happens. I'll press plus, 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 and you see the function's changing. And now I'll press minus on my keyboard, and the function changes again. And notice what's happening to it. How does changing the parameter change the function? So now I'd like to adjust my parameter a little bit. I'll select it, and I'll choose Edit, Properties. And here on the parameter panel, I'm going to change the keyboard adjustments to change by 0.1 units instead of by 1 unit. And on the value panel, I'm going to change the precision to tenths. And then I'll click OK. So now notice what happens when I press plus and minus. Notice how the parameter changes and how the graph changes. So by typing and by pressing plus and minus, I can see some lines, but I can also animate this parameter to see a lot more. So with the parameter selected, I'll choose Display, Animate Parameter. And now you see it's animating, and I have the motion controller, which if I like, I can reverse the direction of animation, or I could pause and play again, or I could stop the animation. So now, we've seen a lot of different lines, one at a time, through pressing plus and minus, and entering different values, and now by animating them, so we saw a lot of different lines. But what if I could see those lines all at the same time? What would that look like? Well, the way that I can do that is, first I'll get rid of the motion controller, and I'll select the parameter, and I'll select the graph of the function, and I'll choose Construct Family of Functions. And I think I'd like to see this with domain -10 to 10, and that's telling me that it'll give me values of m between -10 and 10. And I'll leave everything else, and I'll click OK. So now I get this sort of starburst pattern. And you can think about what this pattern means and why these lines look the way they do. And you might be able to identify the equations of some of the lines. So now we have replaced the original 2 in our equation with m, but we still have this -3, and I'd like to replace that with a parameter as well. So I'll make a new parameter by choosing number, new parameter. This one I'll call b, and I'll give it an initial value of -3. And I'll click OK. So now, once again, I'll double-click my function, and I'll delete the -3, and I'll enter plus, and I'll click on B in my sketch. There. So now I want to look at how this family of functions that's created by varying m between -10 and 10, how does that change if I change this value of b? So I will select b, and I'll just click plus and minus, and think about how this family of functions, how all of these different lines are moving as I change b.